We'll begin with a reading in Esther chapter 6, verses 10 through 14. I believe Scott Goebel's got that.
Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared.
I got ahead of myself here. All right, so on this slide we can see the grooms in procession with there's a footstool here. And as a result, Haman was very likely the person carrying that footstool to proclaim before Mordecai so that he could step up on the horse, "Behold the man whom the king delights to honor." What's funny about this particular concept here? What happened to Haman?
Surprise.
Well, surprise. He's bowing down. He has to stoop down to put this stool down so Mordecai can get on the horse, which was exactly the offense that he decided he was going to have Mordecai hanged for, not bowing to him. All right, so on horseback through the city square, we've got again this plan of the royal city. Over here, the artisan city, kind of where the majority of the population was. This here would be the city square. So it's a relatively small area and would have been where major events took place that the palace was doing as a show for the people. And again, we have the palace. You can see here's the king's gate. That's where Mordecai normally would have sat. And then the square of the city right here outside of the king's gate. The city square was the plaza before the royal compound. It was the nearest that ordinary people could get to the palace complex. So it was a publicly accessible space, as well as one that was being associated with the palace and its honor and its prestige. This is the Triumph of Mordecai. It's an 18th century painting of Haman honoring Mordecai. Obviously, it may or may not be particularly, what's the word I'm looking for? Accurate. Yes, thank you. So, all right. Don't you love Xerxes' response here to Mordecai? He says, "Yeah, that sounds great. Go do that." To Mordecai. We're not told explicitly how Haman felt about this, but read into verses 12 and 13. What's going through Haman's mind?
Whatever it is, it's pretty quick.
Okay, whatever it is, it's pretty quick. Mourning, yeah. It says he's got his head covered. He's feeling overwhelmed. Shame. He's feeling shame. What's the further irony that we find in verse 13?
What his wife said about the Jews.
Yeah. Isn't this his wife and his advisors? A chapter ago, what did they advise him?
Annihilate him.
Go for it. You've got this. Let's build this gallows. Everything is great. Your future is rosy. What changed? Why all of a sudden are these people saying, "Oh, right, that guy that you told us was a Jew. He's Jewish, and now you're done for"? That seems like a really odd turnaround. So what reason do they give for that assessment?
The king's going to honor Mordecai in that level of, pomp and circumstance. That if he's going to choose to, because obviously he's choosing to honor him much more than, Haman. Haman thought
Okay, so Haman has already started to kind of internalize the shift in tides, if you will. He's figured out that there's something going on here. And it's not just that here's this guy that I'd really like to take him down a peg. No, you've plotted to destroy him. And now the king is honoring him because, hey, he saved the king's life. And Xerxes, now is Xerxes from what we have seen in the scripture, is he a thoughtful and does he plan? Is he a planner? No, he's kind of impulsive, isn't he? And so that's the Xerxes that Haman knows. And Xerxes said, hey, great idea, go do it. That's kind of what Haman was thinking he was going to get when he said, I'm going to have Mordecai hanged. And instead, he has to honor him. So, we have this idea that Mordecai is Jewish. Why in the world does that matter? Why are they saying, oh, he's of Jewish descent, so therefore everything's over?
I think they might recognize the historical precedent of strange things happening to the Jews that work out their favor.
Okay. Who has Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 through 11?
Before the men lay down, she came up to the roof and said to the men, I know the Lord has given you the land, and that fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath.
That's Rahab talking to the Jewish spies that came into the land at the start of the invasion of Canaan. There's an acknowledgement there, isn't there? She said, we've heard about the things that happened, how the Red Sea dried up. God's works have been evident to these people. Many of them have seen the workings of God and acknowledged God to some extent. Even the Babylonians, when they came in, do you remember what does the captain of the army say to Jeremiah? He says, your God sent us. He says, I'm here because your God told us to come here. These people understood that there was a God in heaven. Now, they may not have acknowledged him as the only God, but here in Joshua, we see that they were terrified, not just of the God of the land, but of his people as well. And I think we have that same kind of attitude from the Persians here. And to some extent, we see that with Cyrus, right? Cyrus sent them back. He said, oh, what do you mean you have my name in some of your scriptures that are 200 years old? Well, that sounds like a real God to me. How about if you guys go home? I'm going to accomplish the work that was set out for me. So, in spite of the fact that these people are pagan and may not acknowledge God as the only God that there is, they're still pretty well aware of what this God can do. And there's been plenty of evidence, even at the highest levels in the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire, of what God is capable of. All right, any other thoughts on the end of Esther chapter 6 before we go into chapter 7? Go ahead, cool.
I think this was kind of said last time, and just in general, God's will. I think it's just still amazing that to see. It feels like the odds are extremely stacked against him because, like, he's second in command, right, and he's ordered this decree, and yet God still finds a way that, you know, the king happens to read this one thing that Mordecai did, and he's like, okay, let's, like, just the providence of God, and it's just so. Sometimes I don't know if I rely on that enough to where that God's going to take care of it no matter the odds that could be stacked against me, and it may not be visually known that he's taking care of it that way.
I like the story. What you're saying reminds me of Gideon, because what God does there is he deliberately stacks the odds against Gideon, doesn't he? And why does he do that? To show his power. He's saying, you're going to be my deliverer, Gideon, but there's going to be no doubt about whose hand was behind it. The credit goes to God because there is an increasingly improbable series of events that occur that lead to Gideon's victory. So Gideon is victorious, but there's nobody who's going to look at that and say, man, that was an extremely well-executed plan, Gideon. Great job. You're a genius of a general. No, absolutely not. The hand of God is displayed by the things that were done there. And I think to Cole's point, that's something that we can perhaps internalize ourselves. What do we look at when we see, or who do we credit when we see the odds being increasingly stacked in our favor in a potentially improbable way? Whose hand is that but God's? And whose favor is that but God's? And as his people, do we not have the right, as part of the covenant with God, to expect favor from God? And I think we see that same thing coming into play here in Esther. Anyone else? All right, let's read Esther chapter 7, verses 1 through 6.
So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen.
All right. So, let's start with, here's Ashurbanipal. He ruled over the Assyrian Empire from 669 BC to 627 BC. And again, this is one of those rare depictions of women in the cultural art of the places and times. What's interesting to me is here you can see a couple of different styles of furniture. There's the chair with the footstool. There's the couch we're going to see later on described in Esther chapter 7. So there's the reclining couch that the king is on, and that's going to come into play momentarily when we see Haman falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. This is a slide showing a line of slaves from the palace of Darius. It's a facade on the flight of the southern stairway. And as you can see, here's one of them carrying a goat. They're carrying various things up these steps. Esther uses some rather skilled rhetoric here. What does she notably not do? All right, so who signed the edict into play to kill her people? The king did.
She doesn't blame the king.
She doesn't blame the king. There is no mention whatsoever of, you set this in motion. She leaves him entirely out of it. So, she doesn't implicate Xerxes, in spite of the fact that he's the one that signed off on the order. What does she do instead? Okay, she blames Haman. Now, what's interesting about it is she talks about this idea of, if we'd been merely sold as male or female slaves, I would have kept silent because, and different ways of translating it, but I like the one that says, the trouble wouldn't be worth burdening the king. What a statement that is, right? I would totally be okay with all of my people being sold into slavery. That wouldn't be worth troubling the king over. But they've been destroyed. They're going to be destroyed instead. So spare my life and the life of my people, please. There's a little bit of buttering up going on here. And she's painting Haman as not only her enemy, but what?
Enemy of the king.
The enemy of the king, yeah. She's saying there's going to be significant loss to the king in letting this order be carried out. Haman isn't just an enemy of my people. He's undercutting the Persian Empire. He's undercutting you by doing this. And he's tricked you into going along with it. So she's painting Haman as Xerxes' enemy. Haman has undertaken this plot, and it's going to undermine her and her people, and therefore the king. All right, so again, the text does not say where Esther's banquet was held, but evidently it was next to the palace garden. The areas shown highlighted here is probably where that would have been. So again, it's across from the inner court here, where remember the throne room is here, where he sat, where he extended the scepter. Both of those areas are poorly preserved. Little is known about the layout. But Esther again applied, remember last week, what techniques did she use to get Xerxes to go along with what she was doing? And she applies that same thing here, doesn't she? What's the first one? What's that? Yeah. It's like fishing, right? All the fishing attacks want you to do what? How do they get you? A sense of urgency. And she's urging the king along here, isn't she? There's a sense of urgency to it. So she applies that same sense of urgency to her plea. And we know that it works. How do we know that it works? What's Haman's reaction? He's terrified. So if he's terrified, he knows that he's been had. There's also a little bit of a shift in the narrative perspective. Previously, we had the king conferring with Haman, right? Oh, Haman's here. Let's ask him what to do. Oh, here's Haman, and Haman has something he wants me to do. Let's go with that. Now the king is relying on Esther. Her response, the adversary and enemy, is this evil Haman, gives a choice to the king. Is he on Haman's side, or is he on Esther and her people's side? Now, on the one hand, what has Haman done for the king that we have recorded in Esther? Okay, he offered him a bunch of money, but other than that, what has Haman done? He's kind of just put on honors the entire time, hasn't he? It's all been as a sense of self-aggrandizement. Everything was about Haman and for Haman. On the other hand, we have Mordecai, who did what? He saved the king's life, right? So, which one do you like more? Do you like the guy who's been using your power for himself, or do you like the guy who saved your life? I think most of us probably that'd be a pretty easy choice. We like the guy who saved our life. Given Haman's response, we can read the room here, even before we go to verse 7. But let's go ahead and go to verse 7. So Esther chapter 7, verses 7 through 10. Kyle's got that.
Esther 7, 7 through 10. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" And the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, Hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided.
Well, that's a lot to unpack in a short few sentences. So, the king arose in his anger. Why was Xerxes so angry? Go ahead, Steve.
I think one thing that's certainly at play here is that the king had deep feelings for Esther. I believe he loved her very much. And the fact that here was somebody that had plotted to do physical harm against, his wife, someone he loved. I think any of us that, as men that have wives, if we were in that situation, I think we can understand very easily the wrath of the king and his reaction to that.
Okay. So, one thing for sure is that he's seeing this plot against Esther and her people, and then he sees there's something physically happening, and he makes some assumptions, but he's being protective of her. Absolutely. That's one reason he's enraged. What else is there? He was used. He trusted Haman. Now he's feeling a little bit betrayed about this whole thing. You also have this juxtaposition, right? Here's this pleasant meal that Esther has prepared, and then here's Haman, the snake in the grass. And so all of these things come into play. Now, whether the author intends that Xerxes sees this as a good excuse to get rid of Haman without implicating himself, or whether he intends to stress that the trust has totally broken down between Haman and Xerxes, Haman's action here is explained as an attempt to save his life. It's not an attempt to assault Esther. So the final blow to Haman's life is by way of false accusation. What is that similar to?
The very thing that Haman used for the king to get the edict.
It's the very same thing that Haman used to get the edict. And so what he has done has come back to bite him. It's a turning point here. Haman is begging for his life. The tables have turned. Haman replaces Esther as the one who needs to request or beg, and he begs Esther. He doesn't even have access to the king anymore. Haman chooses... Now, here's an interesting thing. Here's why Xerxes thought that Haman was assaulting Esther. We actually have records from kingdoms in that time period. I don't know if they were necessarily from Persia or not. The commentary I was reading didn't say, but there was recorded court etiquette that there is an edict about conduct in a harem that directs that a courtier or eunuch, when he would speak with a woman of the palace, should not approach closer than 7 steps. Okay, so Haman has deliberately broken court etiquette to get closer to Esther. So whether or not he was actually assaulting Esther is irrelevant. He's broken the law, and he's broken court etiquette. So it's almost reasonable for Xerxes to make an assumption that something untoward is going on here. But the servants also recognize the rise of Mordecai. And so we have... Oh, good. There we go. We've got these 3 guys here that are identified by name. And you'll see again here, there's the Ahura Mazda, the god of the Persians. This is the Behistun inscription, and these guys are specifically cited by Darius as having been killed by impalement. A fourth, Phaeortes, is mentioned in the inscription, but is not pictured. Now, I want you to think about this whole thing for a minute. Is there any sense of what we would consider modern justice? Now, obviously, there's a little bit of poetic justice here, but is there a courtroom? No courtroom, no jury, no judge, no due process. It's Haman says, hang him, and he hangs. There's no lawyer. Events proceed as the reader might expect. So, meeting Xerxes' need to make a decision, one of his 7 eunuchs, Harbona, tells him about the extra high gallows that Haman has constructed by his house, adding that Haman intended them for Mordecai. So, Harbona kind of throws a little bit of gas on the fire, doesn't he? Like, oh, you remember that guy you just had honored by sending him around? Haman was plotting to kill him. So here's Haman that's been accused of plotting to destroy his people. Here's solid evidence that Haman was, in fact, plotting to destroy at least one person, including the gallows. And so for the second time, Haman exchanges places with Mordecai. But whereas the first time was all about not receiving the expected honor, now it's about receiving expected and ultimate shaming by being impaled on a pole.
Hey, Aaron.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, half a step back for a comment. You look at that scene with Haman, and it's almost a portrait of the ineptitude of evil. So I don't, my first reading of that is that the king didn't come in, and he may have actually thought that he was assaulting Esther, but of course that doesn't make any sense, because that's not a moment to make a move on the queen. You see what I'm saying? So it
is irrational, yes.
Yeah. So therefore, I personally don't read that as that's what was going on. But the king was so enraged. He's like, oh, now look what's happening. Now look at this guy. He thinks he can.
Yeah.
So he was so enraged that any little thing was going to set him off. But it's almost some irony and some humor there, where it says he fell. What does it say about the? Let's see, he fell across the couch. Yeah. Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. So was that he was kind of throwing himself on the court and was making a huge mistake because of the 7-step rule?
Yeah.
It could have been that. Or it could have been the guy tripped and fell on the couch, and then the king came. You see what I'm saying? I mean, evil ultimately is pretty stupid. I mean, there's even shows about, the stupidest way to die, or stupid criminals. So I almost see this as God's sense of humor, maybe in a way saying, look, this is what happens when you plot against the Lord, and, even the little things that occur are just not going to stack up in your favor, kind of thing. So I may have stressed that a little bit, but, there are some possibilities there.
In the next chapter, in chapter 8, we're going to see Esther falling down before the king. And so this idea of bowing down, prostrating yourself at someone's feet, that's kind of what the picture that I get of Haman, is that he is literally kind of throwing himself at Esther's feet as she's reclining at the couch. But yeah, I mean, it is the ultimate in incompetence, if you will. I've got Kyle over here and then Trish over here.
I think we should remember that in the 6th chapter at the beginning starts with the sleeplessness of the king, and he calls for the records and the annals and the chronicles, and he looks for himself to see if Mordecai had been honored, and he, I think, is offended to a certain extent that no honor or recognition had been given to him. And the kings of these ages, at these times, were known for honoring their constituents. It was a way of getting alliances and keeping them. And so I think it's natural to assume that he's offended by something such as this plot that was reported by Mordecai. And so I think that's a foundation, too, for his anger. Because trust was thrown out the door by Haman, and the king recognizes it, so he goes and searches the records for himself. That is one of the best ways that anyone can determine the truth, is to look for themselves and to find it written. And I think that's important here in this particular story.
There's definitely a sense in which the kings of this era viewed giving honor to people as a way to display their own wealth and power. Mercy was the tool of those who had the power to afford it. And giving honor to people, as the king honors Mordecai, was a way to display the king's power. It wasn't just about raising somebody else up. It was also, by lifting this person up, look how great we are in the process. Go ahead, Trish.
Well, Haman had been in his position, assumably, for some time. So these chamberlains and people of the court, this wasn't his first fall from grace. So they had no feeling of loyalty at all to him. And I've always thought, why did the king sign the edict if it included killing his own wife?
Well, he didn't know Esther was Jewish at the time.
I went back in chapter 3, and Haman calls it these people.
Mm-hmm.
So evidently, these people were what he was using instead of saying the Jews, because the Jews would have, if he'd used that term, the king would have known that Esther was a Jew and she would be included. Or
he at least would have known that Mordecai was known to be a Jew. Esther was not. Because we see later that it's now that Esther has revealed who her people are. But to your point, Haman does couch the terms very carefully. He avoids mentioning which people they are. He just says, there's this people that has different laws and they do different things and they're known to be a rebellious people. Let's just get rid of them. He doesn't say which people it is. And so that does come into play. You're absolutely right. He's kind of hidden that.
Well, my other question is, who were these men that were to carry this out? Were they the king's men or were they Haman's?
Oh, they would have been the king's men, yeah.
So he was going to allow all of his men to be slaughtered by the Jews now when they got permission to protect themselves.
Yes. Well, and we'll get to that in a little bit with the second edict that goes out. All right, I saw somebody else. I got Peggy over here. Go ahead.
Well, I see so much irony in this, in that Haman hates the Jews so much, but yet he prostrates himself to a Jew.
Very true. And he just had to bow before Mordecai, too, with the footstool. All right, go ahead.
I was just thinking of the setting, the pleasant meal that was going on, and then Haman, it's discovered he's the enemy. And it made me think of Jesus and the Passover, the Last Supper, where Judas is the enemy, but the mercy of our King to let him go. And then just the substitutionary death that satisfied the wrath of the king. Haman ends up dying instead of Mordecai, but of course here, Haman is the guilty man that deserved death, kind of symbolic of us, that we deserve death, but our king, the substitution was, he had mercy on us, and it was his death of an innocent man substituted for us.
And it's interesting you mentioned that. We'll segue right into this slide here, because that is oops, I pushed the wrong button. That's a depiction of Xerxes. That was a statue made in his image, and so that's kind of what his face looked like. Now, although Haman is dead, the threat to the Jewish people remains. The king's edict has gone out. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Well, Peggy mentioned the irony of all this, and it's so true. This whole story just drips with irony.
Yes.
And talking about Haman, I could make an analogy with him and Wile E. Coyote. Everything he plans, all of his schemes and his traps and everything ends up going against him. And it's so evident when you read it now, but his life was nothing but a series of highs and lows, and then the ultimate low. So it's kind of a sad character.
He is, and now I'm going to be picturing Haman as Wile E. Coyote. Go ahead.
I know we spoke so much about Haman, but when you look at Esther, she has grown and matured so much. Because you remember initially she didn't want to have anything to do with this. Mordecai had to convince her that God does have a plan for her. So to see that strength, and now she's saving her people, is tremendous.
It is. And there's a tremendous amount of, you're absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of growth on Esther's part that we see even from the beginning of the book, where she's going quietly along with what Mordecai has asked her to do. And then she takes a little bit of convincing to go into this next phase of things. But this is her plan. And she's pulled everything off. And now the king is looking to her for advice where he used to look to Haman. Go ahead, Cole.
I think something else that's, sorry, I'm kind of jumping all around, but I'm just going back to after what Kyle said, just because I think it's really interesting to think about how Mordecai, like this government, he finds that there's a plan to kill the king. And you would think that this is a government that God didn't intend, right? Like God did not want this government. You know, he knows that we're God's people. Well, why would he say something about that king, you know, that he's going to die? Because in a sense, I would almost think, well, great, this king's going to die, and maybe like that's how God's going to take our people. And I just think, I'm just saying, to me, this is also a good idea for me to understand maybe how we should be in a subjection to who's ever our ruler. Not to say this applies 100% all the time, but it's just really interesting how like he's basically still doing God's will in the sense of like he's still doing good things and preventing evil from maybe happening, and it ended up turning out for good.
Well, you make an excellent point. I want to hit on that for just a second, because what we have in the best of the Jewish people is a history of honoring kings who didn't deserve honor. What does David say about Saul? My Lord the king, I will not harm the Lord's anointed. What did Daniel's 3 friends say when brought before Nebuchadnezzar? How do they address him? You evil jerk? No. O king, live forever. They give him the honor and respect that the office that he holds deserves. And then Daniel, even before Belshazzar, honors the king. Says, you don't want me to read what's written up there, but I'll do it. Daniel before Darius, he honors the king, even though the king has him thrown into a den of lions. Esther and Mordecai before Xerxes, they honor the king, even though what we've seen of Xerxes' character isn't exactly stellar. He's impulsive, he's angry, he's prone to making poor choices. But they honor the king. Do we honor our kings who make poor choices, who we don't particularly like their policies, who we feel are against us? There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? All right, bell rang, but go ahead, Jared. And so we're not going to make it through chapter 8. That's okay.
It's interesting. I'm just listening to you. I mean, you mentioned all those things that Xerxes was.
Yes.
He's human.
That's true.
Right? He's human. And so we all have those different traits and characteristics and emotions and impulses balanced with the ability to plan and make wise decisions and well thought out. That is what separates us from God. Is we were human from the perspective of we're not going to get it right. And through the entire class this morning, I've thought in my mind, this is our modern day government. It's no different. So
You're exactly
often,
right.
the chief or the office gets blamed. It's not a unilateral decision. There's advisors and people with agendas underneath that push it uphill, and it just gets signed off on as an executive order.
That's true.
Xerxes signed off on an executive order that was Haman's agenda.
Yeah.
With very little detail that he uncovered for the king.
I think that's a very fair way of looking at it. And to that point also, we do have to credit Xerxes a little bit. I mean, even though he's impulsive and even though he is he has some of these characteristics, he relies on other people for advice. He's not just making all of these decisions himself in a vacuum. And there is definitely some good to that type of character who says, you know what, I don't know everything, and I know how to delegate. So let's rely on the people whose job it is to help me out here and let them do their job. I saw another, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what a time to live, right? I think the thing that's really important to me is what you just pointed out, and that is, think about, these are supposed to be the people to take care of him. I mean, look at how we started in chapter 2 and so forth, where, you know, these are the people that are supposed to be the guards to protect him. And how nothing was really said. The Jew, you know, Mordecai had to come and bring it to their attention. Well, now look at where we're at chapter 7. It's also common knowledge, apparently, that Haman had this pole stuck up. Because who chimed in, but only chimed in after the fact that it was brought up. So it makes you wonder, you know, if I'm King Xerxes, you know, my life is always under besiege and threat.
And it makes sense then later on we're going to see that the king honors Mordecai and puts him in Haman's position. So, you know, who better to put in that position than the guy who saved your life, right? And why not trade out the one who was plotting against you for the one who did everything he could to help you? So Xerxes does have this, at least one good habit, right? He's replacing bad advisors with better advisors as he gets them. And so although Haman was dead, what we're going to run into next week is that the threat to the Jewish people remains. Because Haman has died, but the edict is still active. And as we're going to see, that can't be repealed. The plot was not over. So, read Esther chapter 8, and actually read the rest of it, 8 through 10. 9 and 10 are short, it's okay. And we'll get through as much as we can next week. Thank you all for your comments and attention. I really do appreciate the participation.